Hi everyone, welcome back to the Plain Fun RC channel. I'm your host, Saul. We have gone ahead and we've installed the servo for the left aileron. And so now we have both aileron servos installed, and you can see here, got a nice little movement happening. Always pretty to see that. So all things are good, so we're done with the wing. The only thing we got to do is we just have to go ahead and install a bolt here. And it's my understanding it's going to be a blind nut, and then it'll be 5 millimeters, and then we'll be totally done with the wings. But for right now, we're done with this in terms of the installation of the aileron servos. We're now going to go ahead and move on to the center wing section here, as you can see, and we're going to dive into the flaps. The flaps are still sitting right over there, and the epoxy has cured completely. So we're going to move on and put the hinges in place. That's going to be our first thing, and then we'll go ahead and we'll put in the servos after that. So the fun begins. More to come. All right, folks, continuing with our update for the 40% scale air, sea, race, pond racer. We are on to the flaps. And as mentioned previously, you would not have to do the installation of the hinges that I'm doing. The flaps come pre-installed. But as I mentioned, when I had to cut them free, then of course, we had to put hinges on there. So anyway, let me explain what I'm doing here. So these are the hinges that we're using. You can see them there. And we're using good old-fashioned 3M double sticky back tape. Right here, as you can see. And double-sided tape. And that is holding the hinges in place. It allows me to get proper placement. We put them first on the flap, and we're putting the larger end on the flap and the smaller end on the wing. So we got a piece of double sticky back tape right here, as you can see. And what we're doing is we're making sure that this is nice and flush in here. And there's just a tiny bit of space here, so between this part of the wing. Let me see if I can show you real quick. There it is, a little tiny bit of space. So when this comes down, it doesn't rub on the actual pod that'll be sitting out here. Now there's a rather large gap right there. That's pretty big. We're gonna fix that after we get the flap on there. That's because of the cut I had to make in order to free it from the epoxy. Okay, so we're just gonna go ahead, and right now this is nice and level. I'm just gonna give this a nice little push down, and that should just fall right into place. Oop, doesn't seem to want to go in place. Okay, well, let me go ahead and work on that. Anyway, so that's what we're doing. They're equal distance from the ends here and here. And then what we're going to do once we get this in place, then we'll go ahead and we'll drill the holes. And we'll put a little epoxy in the holes before putting the screw, and let that dry, and then put the screws in, because there's just foam sandwiched between these two, and obviously the foam is not going to hold the screws. But these hinges are going to get epoxied in place. And that's because the force that's going to be generated because of the speed of the aircraft upon landing, and the fact that these flaps are deflected at 75 degrees and 90 degrees. So they're more like speed brakes more so than flaps, because the plane lands so fast. Anyway, all right, more to come. All right, continuing with our update, you can see we've got our hinges tacked in place with the double sticky back tape. Let's go ahead and check how we're doing here in terms of the actual throw. That's perfect. Look at that. Drops right in place, and that's nice and even. Can't ask for anything better. Let's look at it from the side here. Yep, that looks great. So we got our exact positioning of where the hinges need to be. So now we're going to go ahead and drill the necessary holes, and then we'll take the necessary steps of securing them in place with some epoxy. All right, more to come. All right, continuing with our update with our Air Sea Race, the flap installation. Right now we're focusing on the servos. I want to show you something really neat. We're going to use these side mounts here. Now these side mounts came with the plane from the previous owner. There is a spot on the internet that does have them, and they do sell different sizes for different size servos. And basically the way it works is here's the frame itself. The servo just drops into the frame, much like you see here. Then you take these pieces here, and I've got one with a screw on it, as you can see. And then they just get bolted in place like so. Now, what we're doing, normally there are wood screws, as you can see, that does come with wood screws, but those wood screws are not long enough. I don't think they were made for this particular mount. So these are 2 millimeter socket heads. We're going through, we're tapping these holes here with a 2mm tap. And then we're putting just a drop of thin CA, as you can see here, and then a drop of Instaset in there. Give it a second to dry, and then the holes get re-tapped again with 2mm, and then we're mounting the servo here. So these are fantastic. One of the reasons I decided to use these as opposed to the metal Seacraft side servo mounts is that the manufacturer, Michael at Air Sea Race, says that the mount that goes in for the flap must be epoxied in place. So because these are a very heavy-duty plywood, I'll be able to go ahead and just epoxy these in place. And we do have a screw hole here and a screw hole here to also screw it in place. So we're going to give it a double extra protection there to go through and make sure it's mounted properly. So, more to come. All right, continuing with our update here, we have flaps. So everything is in place. We just have to go ahead and install the servos for the flaps. But our hinges look great. Everything is fantastic. And we're just moving along like grease lightning. So we'll get the flap servos installed, and I think at that point we're going to go ahead and move on to the pods, and we'll start working with the landing gear at that point. So more to come. All right, continuing with our update here, we have our aileron servo in place. We're going to epoxy it. I just wanted to do a dry fit, make sure everything was working great. It is, it's perfect. We've got our blue tape just holding the aileron in place, which allows me to go ahead and properly position the servo. We're using that's a Dubro ball link, but it's got a 256 screw onto a 440 rod, and we're using this Hanger 9 titanium Pro Links 4-inch, and the part that is connecting onto the flap here is a Sullivan goldenrod clevis 440. And it works great. So the combination is perfect. Now you'll notice, this is important. I'm going to show you something. You'll see, there we go. You'll see if you look at the mount for the servo, notice how it aligns perfectly with the plate. I'm sorry, let me see if I can zoom in a little bit better. There we go. Bit of a shadow. Let me see if I can, there we go. That's a little bit better. There we go. Okay, look at the servo mount and look at the plate that's inside the wing. Look at the edges over here and over here, and you'll notice how it aligns perfectly with the plate. That's the first thing you need to be aware of, okay, if you're using this, whatever mount you wind up using. The other thing is I drew a line right here, and that goes right to the opening, which is at the trailing edge. And you'll notice when we look at the push rod, right there, you'll notice how it lines up perfectly with that line. So those are the two key things you need to be aware of when you're going through and you're setting this up. And we're using a Dubro Futaba arm on there, the longer arm, if you will. When you go, Dubro sells arms for Futaba servos, and we just took a full arm and cut it in half. So it's the longest arm that's on there. Not a 3D arm, just the longest arm. You'll see it in the set when you purchase it. Anyway, so we're going to put some epoxy in there, let that sit. You could probably even get away with some CA. You can see some of the holes in the frame down there of the servo, for the mounting frame for the servo. I'm sure I could probably put some CA in there, and that would hold it. But because of the amount of force that is going to be generated on that flap, I want to make sure I've got the strongest glue possible. I don't want this servo popping loose in flight. So we're going to go ahead and do that, and then once we're done with that, we'll go ahead and we'll move on to this servo. Now, there's going to be a complication here that I didn't realize when I was screwing in the actual screws for the hinges. I did not check the opening, and I've got a screw sitting right there, which is going to be in the way of the actual actual push rod. So I'm going to have to go through and somehow cut that away or dramatically reduce it. So this is going to be tricky. And then I realized the opening itself is going to have to move over this way a little bit because of where the horn is for the actual flap. So more to come. The drama never ends. All right, we've got our servos installed for our flaps. So the flaps are done. What we're doing right now is we need to go ahead and put the covers back on. So we've got our these are very thin fiberglass covers, as you can see, about the thickness of a credit card. Heck, you could probably even use a credit card, to be honest with you. Anyway, what I've done is we're going to be taking popsicle sticks. I've cut off about a quarter of it, and you can see I've got a couple installed right under here, and those are going to become the hard points, as we're going to be putting in 4 screws for each hatch there to hold it in place. They're not supporting any weight, so just some simple, I got some small Dubro servo screws, which will be perfect for this. And then we'll be done with flaps, and then we're going to go ahead and move on to the canopy next. The fun begins.